interesting medieval debates, but was not able to find any. Perfect. And Madalena, give me the go ahead when we're all set on Facebook.
All set.
Perfect. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Happy fourth day of Hanukkah and happy third session. Just to do a brief review, today will be understandable even if you missed the first two sessions, but if today is interesting, you can always go back and on the Jewish Collaborative's YouTube, there are the first two sessions. So just big picture of where we're at, what we're doing, and then today's actually, well, today and the last session are the two that I'm the most excited for, because now that we have a lot of the basic building blocks of understanding these wider medieval Jewish philosophic debates, we can start to go to sort of next level phenomena in terms of how it relates to, I think, contemporary Jewish practice and what it means to be a Jew in so many senses in the modern world. So just the brief 90-second review, and then we will continue on. We have been in Spain in the Middle Ages. We've discussed two of the titans of Jewish thought throughout history. There's an interesting line, I believe it's Menachem Kellner, who was both a scholar of Maimonides and also Judah Halevi, that taught that he was playing on the phrase that every thinker in the Western world is either in the tradition of Aristotle or the tradition of Plato. And he said, well, every Jew in the modern age is either in the tradition of Maimonides or the tradition of Judah Halevi. But just a brief review, Judah Halevi, we met him 2 weeks ago, and Judah Halevi, again, Spanish doctor, poet, a staunch traditionalist who believed that Judaism is a self-contained system of truth. And so it doesn't make a difference what you learn from philosophy and what you learn from science and what you learn from the field of mathematics. At the end of the day, we know Judaism is true because of an unbroken chain of history back to Mount Sinai. And because we have that internal truth, nothing else from the outside can contradict it. Nothing else from the outside can bolster its truth claims. On the way opposite side of the spectrum, we have Moses Maimonides, also a Spanish doctor, a little bit less of a poet. And Maimonides taught the exact opposite. Maimonides said, if philosophy and science is able to get closer to truths in the world and the universe, and he certainly did believe that through scientific and philosophic inquiry, you can come to truths, then clearly Judaism, if it's also true, needs to be reconcilable and it needs to be able to fit in with Greek thought. And so Maimonides writes his magnum opus, Guide to the Perplexed, describing how Jewish ideas of God and Greek ideas of God fit in neatly together. And we discussed a lot last week how Maimonides ends up having to tie himself into all sorts of loops and knots to reconcile a God who, if you read the Tanakh and you read the Talmud, God almost appears as a much stronger person or a much stronger king that has emotions, that punishes, that has desires. And comparing that to Aristotle's God, who was stoic, who was the prime mover, Maimonides spends much of his book trying to reconcile to that. So here we are today, class number 3, and we are at a great tension point in Jewish thought. And this is where we get into some fascinating understandings of Maimonides. And I'm going to attempt to make the claim, and this is one such way to read Maimonides. I won't pretend that this is the only way, but I'm going to attempt to make the claim that Maimonides' rationalism and the mysticism that ends up being known as Kabbalah are actually two sides of the same coin. And instead of thinking of rationalism and mysticism within the Jewish tradition as diametrically opposed, I want to suggest that rationalism and mysticism in terms of our Jewish worldview are really the same thing. So that is what I'm going to throw out there. But I want to introduce the question real quick, and then I'll take some moments if anybody has any preliminary thoughts or questions. And that is as follows. There is a tension within Jewish thought that runs all the way back even through the earliest pages of the Tanakh. And this tension is one that I don't think is going to be new to anybody here, but this tension is between God's immanence and God's transcendence. Another way to say that is the tension is between a God who is outside of the confines of the universe, a God who is infinite or in some way too great to be contained within any material or any finite substance, versus a God who relates to us as somebody we talk to, somebody we pray to, somebody we try to have a relationship with. And just to give one way to think about this, perhaps the biggest tension point in the Tanakh surrounding this question has to do when King Solomon is about to build the temple. And King Solomon is, right, just for us to remember, this is in the book of Kings, Solomon, the son of David. This is right when they have united the wider tribes and they've set up the kingdom. And King Solomon now spends billions of dollars building this massive temple in the middle of Jerusalem. And he has this very famous poem that right at the beginning of the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple, King Solomon starts to say, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the wider speech says, I have built this house of God, yet can a house of God contain God's glory? God said, I have wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. I did not need a house, yet I have built this house to contain God's glory. And the poem is fascinating because it oscillates back and forth between two ideas in our tradition that still, by the way, are at tension. Namely, if God is infinite, if God is everywhere, if God is ubiquitous, then how can any individual make a claim that God is more in one place than another, right? If we think about this in a very practical way, if somebody were to say that a synagogue is holier than a place that's not a synagogue, right, which hopefully everybody here would agree that Judaism would make that claim, that synagogues are holier than a forest or not a synagogue, you're in some way insinuating that a synagogue is more godly, which in some way is saying there's more of God in this place, which in some way contradicts the idea that God is infinite and God is everywhere. And so this is a tension that a lot of Jewish thinkers have to deal with. Again, we're not going to spend too much time on this tension throughout the Tanakh, but this tension can clearly be felt all throughout the wider Jewish tradition. If anybody is interested in delving a little bit more onto this in particular, feel free to send me a message after, because there's a lot of fascinating material when it comes to this. But we're going to get to this within Maimonides' thought. And as I said before, I'm going to attempt to make the claim that Maimonides might have been a little bit more of a mystic than he usually gets credit for. But I'm going to share my screen. And while I'm sharing my screen, I'll take a second to see if anybody has any preliminary thoughts, questions, anything like that. Perfect. Okay. So just so people don't think I'm crazy, just to base this off a quote of a really interesting thinker, Abraham Abulafia, who was also a later Spanish thinker. Just to introduce him a little bit, he's an interesting thinker because he was an early Kabbalist. He was around in the time right before the Zohar, and he was very against, and we're going to discuss the Zohar a little bit probably later today or during our last session, but the Zohar is one such book, and that really tries to deal with this contradiction or this clash between God's transcendence and God's immanence. But before Abraham already gets there, he was thought to have been both one of the great mystics of medieval Spain, and he also was one of the top scholars of Maimonides' philosophy and Maimonides' rationalism that we discussed the last 2 weeks. And he even has an interesting quote here that he says, there are only two great books of Kabbalistic study. What are these two books? These two books are Sefer Yetzirah. I think we discussed Sefer Yetzirah for a couple minutes 2 weeks ago, but just for a reminder, Sefer Yetzirah was a Talmudic times book that dealt with a little bit of Jewish mysticism. But for the purpose of our conversation, the second great Kabbalistic book is the Guide to the Perplexed of Maimonides. Now, I'm hoping that everybody here is a little bit shocked by the statement, because Maimonides is thought of to be the opposite of what we think of a Kabbalistic thinker in two reasons. One, the word Kabbalah itself means a received tradition. And so already from the outset, Saying that somebody is a Kabbalist means that somebody is a part of a received tradition, and Kabbalah to some extent is the opposite of philosophy, right? If you receive truth through tradition, that is the opposite to discovering truths out there in the world. So already one way in which Kabbalah and rationalism / philosophy are opposites, but there's an even deeper way, which is mysticism or Kabbalah fundamentally preserves the fact that the universe is mysterious, whereas rationalism suggests that it's at least in theory possible to make sense of everything in the known universe. And so these are two completely different vantage points. But I want to try to show how towards the end of Maimonides' book, after he spends the entire time buttressing the claim that it's all about rationality, that prophecy is really just a type of heightened intellectualism, that the mitzvot are really just used to perfect our intellectual and philosophical skills, here is how Maimonides ends his Guide to the Perplexed. And this is probably one of the most famous analogies or metaphors that Maimonides gives. So I'm excited to read this, and then I would love to have a little bit of a conversation with everybody here, because I think this is ripe for discussion. So he gives this famous parable at the end of the Guide to the Perplexed, where he says, the ruler is in his palace, and all the subjects are partly within the city and partly outside the city. So Maimonides is giving us a picture of a nice palace, and you have a king that's in the palace, and all of the king's subjects are spread around, right? Some are in the city and some are on the outskirts. Of those who are in the city, some have their backs turned upon the ruler's habitation, their faces being turned the other way. Others seek to teach the ruler's habitation, turn towards it, and desire to enter it and to stand before him, but up to now they have not yet seen the wall of the habitation. Some of those who seek to reach it have come up to the habitation and walk around it, searching for its gate. Some of them have entered the gate and walked about in the antechambers. Some of them have entered the inner court of the habitation and have come to be with the kind in one and the same place as him, namely in the ruler's habitation. But their having come into the inner part of the habitation does not mean that they see the ruler or speak to him. For after their coming into the inner part of the habitation, it is indispensable that they should make another effort. Then they will be in the presence of the ruler, see him from afar or from nearby, or hear the ruler's speech or speak to him. So Maimonides is giving us a parable that you can imagine a village that is surrounding a temple. And just like you would imagine, within this village, there are the town folks that are scattered throughout. And you have some people that are in the city, some people outside the walls of the city, some people that are in the king's courtyard, some people that are within the inner gates of the antechamber of the king's courtyard. But regardless of anybody's situation, nobody's actually able to talk to this ruler. And so Maimonides gives us, of course, the interpretation of this parable that we'll discuss. So he says, now I shall interpret to you this parable that I have invented. I say then, those who are outside the city are all human individuals who have no doctrinal beliefs, neither one based on speculation, nor one that accepts the authority of tradition. The status of those is like the irrational animals, right? So Maimonides says, and you can excuse his crude analogy here, Maimonides says, the people that are way outside the city, those are people who have no guiding beliefs. Those are people who have never really thought about anything, people that don't have any beliefs, people that you could imagine if you ask them the important questions in life, they say, I don't know, I've never really thought about it, right? What is the meaning of life? I'm not sure, right? For Maimonides, those people have the same intellectual or philosophic status as animals. And again, he's not making a claim that their value is like animals, but he's saying, just like you don't expect animals in the animal kingdom to go through higher order processing to try to figure out the meaning of life, so too, these people that have no belief, that have never tried to figure out through speculation what the value or the point of all this is, right? They are outside the city. He says, those who are within the city but have turned their backs upon the ruler's habitation are people who have opinions and are engaged in speculation, but who have adopted incorrect opinions. They are those concerning whom necessity at certain time impels killing them and blotting out the traces that our opinions left, that they should lead astray the way of others. So Maimonides continues, and I can imagine people will even more so not like this line by Maimonides, but I'll try to explain it. Maimonides says, one step almost better or closer than the animal-like people that are on the outside of the city are people who have incorrect beliefs about the world. What Maimonides is probably talking about is idolatry, which, again, unpacking Maimonides' view of idolatry would take an entire other class, but suffice it to say, Maimonides was against idolatry, not because he thought that, oh, it's a shame that God gets very embarrassed or ashamed if I were to bow down to sticks, but for Maimonides, idolatry contradicted the entire truth claims of Judaism, and for Maimonides, a society that would worship material goods is a society that would become increasingly immoral, because people would be worshipped and the material goods would be worshipped, and then humans would end up on a hierarchy. So when Maimonides says sometimes you actually have to kill people based off of belief, this isn't Maimonides being a religious fanatic saying, well, anybody who doesn't believe in with my religious presuppositions deserves to be killed. Maimonides is saying there are some views, and again, whether or not anybody here agrees with this, let's package that question for another time. But Maimonides is suggesting there are some beliefs that are so terrible that it sometimes commands blotting out the traces of them. He then goes on, and don't worry, we'll have time to discuss all of this, just a couple more lines. Those who seek to reach the ruler's habitation and to enter it, but never see the ruler's habitation, are the multitudes of adherents of the law. I refer to the ignoramuses who observe the commandments, right? So now Maimonides is throwing shade on the people that are in the school of thought of Judah Halevi to some extent, right? People who say, well, the point of Judaism is to keep Jewish law, right? Is to keep halacha, and to every day you wake up and you say, well, what does the Talmud or what does the Shulchan Aruch tell me I need to do today? And that's what you do because that's Jewish law, because that's what being an important Jew is following Jewish law. Maimonides says, well, they are certainly better than the animals, certainly better than the people on the outskirts, but they are the ignoramuses, and they are trying to reach the habitation of the ruler, but never actually reaching it. Those who have come up to the habitation and walk around it are the jurists who believe true opinions on the basis of traditional authority and study the law concerning the practices of divine service, but do not engage in speculation concerning the fundamental principle of religion and make no inquiry whatsoever regarding the rectification of belief. Those who have plunged into speculation concerning the fundamental principles of religion have entered the antechambers. People there indubitably have different ranks. So Maimonides gives us two more layers. He says the people that are right up to the antechambers are the people who attempt to understand the theory of law, people who attempt to understand tradition, right? Those are maybe people who within Jewish tradition are a little bit more interested in picking apart internally, right? Why do we keep Shabbat? What is the rationale of the Talmud when giving us the laws of kosher, right? But for Maimonides, again, there was one step more, which we've discussed a lot about the last two sessions. So I'll say this, then we'll take some time for some questions or some thoughts, and then I'll show you how this directly relates to our next step. Maimonides says the ideal, right? The people who have entered into the antechamber, right? Those are people who have plunged into the speculation concerning the fundamental principles of religion, right? Those who are willing to think about and rationally and inquire into all of life's biggest questions, right? Those are the people who get to sit into the antechamber. The last thing I'll say, and then I would love to hear some thoughts, I'll unshare my screen in a second, is that for Maimonides, this was clearly a wider metaphor about God, right? That God is this king that's in the middle of the palace, and you have all types of different people that are desperately trying to connect to God, right? Essentially, right, the goal of life for Maimonides, the goal of life for any medieval thinker, I would argue the goal of life for many of us today is to connect to God. And so for Maimonides, this was a layered approach of connecting to God, with the ideal way of connecting to God being intellectual inquiry and process at the end of the day, right? So this very much, right, if anybody over the course of the last two sessions were skeptical in terms of my continuous claim that Maimonides was man of thought and philosophy over action, hopefully this should seal it. I'm going to complicate it a little bit in about 20 minutes or next class, depending on the timing. But for now, I would love to hear some thoughts, questions, anything and everything. And don't be shy. I know people here have thoughts. It's hard to see people's hands. So if you have something, just shout it out. Ellen, were you going to say something?
He says there's a step after they enter the antechamber up above where you just read. What is that step? Death?
Sorry, ask that question one more time.
Maimonides said that there is a step after you enter the antechamber before you can see God or whoever the king is. What is that step after the antechamber?
So the step right after the antechamber is, he says, so it's a great question. I did cut off the quote a little bit prematurely. So just to have it here, Maimonides says, those who have succeeded in finding a proof for everything that can be proved, who have a true knowledge of God so far as a true knowledge can be attained, are near the truth. Wherever an approach to truth is possible, they have reached the goal or in the palace where the king lives. The reason why I didn't use this quote, there's a similar quote that he has later. This quote sort of starts to equivocate on a lot of things, which is where Maimonides gets really interesting, where up till now, Maimonides seems like the staunch philosopher that everything can be proven. And then towards the end of the book of the Guide to the Perplexed, there's 54 chapters in part 3. So we're, 5 pages from the end. Maimonides all of a sudden starts to say that it might actually be impossible to actually solve everything, right? So Maimonides was not a modernist in the sense of, he did not believe that you can come up with some grand philosophic or mathematical theory to prove everything in the universe, because he keeps on equivocating and saying, well, you can get near to the truth, right? You can approach the truth, right? And the goal in life for Maimonides is to try to approach the truth. And so one of the interesting things that we get with Maimonides, and we'll see how this, in a minute, we'll see how this actually turns out to a practical way of living for Maimonides, because he ends up saying a lot of counterintuitive, pragmatic advice towards the end, but hopefully it'll all make sense how it fits together. For Maimonides, the goal of life was not to reach truth. For Maimonides, the goal of life was the search for truth. And I think it's a very important difference, where Maimonides did not believe that it was impossible to ever find capital T truth. And okay, you are now with the king, and you are now, in this metaphor, you're never actually able to talk to the king. And Maimonides gives proof after proof, probably the most interesting biblical proof text, which hopefully a couple of you, it already popped into your head when I said biblical proof text, is the famous story of Moses and God, when on Mount Sinai, Moses asks God, show me your face. And God says, you cannot see my face and live. And so for Maimonides, Moses was the philosopher par excellence, right? Nobody can be wiser than Moses. And even Moses was unable to see the face of the king. All Moses got was a glimpse of the back. And for Maimonides, this was a rule of the universe, that it's actually impossible for human beings to understand capital T truth, right? We can get close, right? So he didn't think that it was a fool's errand. He obviously believed that Moses was closer to the truth, and Moses was closer to God, and Moses lived from some perspective, a better life, right? Although we can complicate that term in a little bit, than people who are not Moses. But at the end of the day, right, you are completely right, Ellen, that there is almost a asymptote of where knowledge can come up against, that Maimonides did not believe that it was possible to get further than that point. It's a great question. Sylvia, did you have a comment?
I might have, but it was a long time ago. So I'll come back to it. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so I want to try to do two things. Somebody just
Real
wrote a
quick.
question in the chat, so
Sorry.
just to read the question real quick. Somebody asked, "Isn't teshuva, approaching God, always possible? If the people who are currently on the outside are destroyed, they are denied the opportunity in their lifetime to draw closer to God." Rosalind, you're definitely right. Maimonides is dealing a lot less with the practical than I think he's dealing with the philosophical. So I think you're definitely right. Although I should note, and this is I don't want to go on this tangent unless people find it super interesting. Maimonides was actually one of the rare Jewish thinkers that did not believe in universal teshuva rights. And so what I mean by that is Maimonides actually believed that somebody can lose their right to repent. And this was a very minority opinion, but Maimonides bases it off of his understanding of the story of Pharaoh. When God hardens Pharaoh's heart, Maimonides says, well, Pharaoh lost his right to do teshuva. So for Maimonides, he actually did believe philosophically you could do something bad enough that would make it so that you can't redeem yourself. But that's a whole separate can of worms. Maddie, go for it.
I was just gonna say the use of the word speculation, I find it interesting because it is like not material, or it's something that is not materializing. And in that way, if you're not satisfying like material needs, then the question is, are you trying to satisfy spiritual needs? Which I feel like would connect more to the like draws of mysticism than. Does that make sense?
A little bit. You're saying that for Maimonides, to some extent, this was non-material in any way, right? Like, is that what you're saying, that these beliefs are not going to make you do anything differently, so they can only have an internal difference? Or am I misunderstanding you?
Yes, or at least they're not necessarily going to satisfy like a material need of the material body. And in that way, there's like an assumed higher need that it would be satisfying instead.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. And one of the actually interesting parts of Maimonides is he runs dangerously close to a type of antinomianism, which is, right? So because for Maimonides, the entire system of halacha and Jewish law was in service of a higher purpose, as opposed to it being important in and of itself. And so Maimonides, again, he attempts to defend his appreciation of Jewish law and halacha, but you're totally right that for Maimonides, to some extent, the ideal religious thinker is not necessarily somebody who is practicing Jewish law, but is somebody who actually is taking the ideas. And so one of the ways in which Maimonides actually does connect to the Kabbalistic tradition, because the Kabbalistic tradition, at least some of it, ends up also challenging the centrality of Jewish law as a part of Jewish tradition. So it connects there, unless I'm totally misunderstanding what you're saying. But did that connect?
Yes, no, it totally did. Thank you.
Perfect. So let's actually, I'm going to switch up my own ordering of these sources here, because I wanted to just finish off with Maimonides. And so then during our last session is actually going to be in about a month. It's going to be the first session after the new year. But Maimonides ends off with a beautiful way to end his book, which I think is connected to the fact that at this point, so just to center us, because we've really talked about Maimonides for 3 weeks, we've compared him to Judah Halevi, and then we'll talk a little bit in our last session about how the particularism of Judah Halevi and the universalism of Maimonides ends up being fused, and Jewish tradition ends up sort of taking both of them. And this can be seen most clearly in Jewish mysticism, which really is a symbiosis between the God is infinite of Maimonides and God is particular and knowable of Judah Halevi. But Maimonides ends us off with wanting a little bit more, because as I think everybody here is a little bit frustrated, and at least every time, the first couple of times I looked at this analogy, right, it is a little bit frustrating, because if the point of Judaism, right, just to run through Maimonides' thought real quick, if the point of Judaism is a search for philosophic truth, and everything else we do in Judaism is in service of that search for truth. And at the end, if that search for truth ends with question marks and ends with us being left in the antechamber, not even getting to see the king, that is really frustrating to some extent. And it also goes contrary to the way or the solace that a lot of people find in religious traditions, which is a sense of truth, a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. Maimonides leaves us off with almost a search that's never going to end, and leaves us with a Judaism that is a lot more process-oriented in terms of, well, it's about intellectual search and all of these things. And for a lot of people, that can be very frustrating. For a lot of people also, right, I kept hinting to this last time, but about 100 years after Maimonides writes his Guide to the Perplexed and it starts getting spread around the Jewish world, there were massive book burnings. This is the book that has been burned by Jews more than any other book in history, is probably the Guide to the Perplexed, because this book started spreading around to the rest of the Sephardic community. It went north to the Ashkenazi community, and people started hating this book because not only did it contain individual ideas that might have contradicted Judaism, but by now we can see this entire book is almost suggesting a completely different religious tradition than what we know to be traditional Judaism, right? There's Judaism to some extent, and that contains the Tanakh, that contains the Talmud, that contains early commentaries on the Talmud, that contains books like Judah Halevi's Kuzari, and then we have the religion of Maimonides, which is really just a veiled search for philosophy, but Judaism is sort of the packaging that it takes the form of. And so you really can view Maimonides' religious tradition as almost a completely different religion, which is certainly what people try to argue against Maimonides. And so to some extent, Maimonides leaves us wanting a little bit more. And I believe that Maimonides also wanted a little bit more. And so there are actually two interesting things that come up with for Maimonides. We'll discuss the second one today. I'll leave the last one for 3 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now. But one, just to throw it out there, which becomes obvious, you can now start to see, hopefully, how this endless search for philosophic truth, while knowing that philosophic truth is never actually reachable, while also knowing that because God created the universe, that understanding the universe helps you understand God, how that eventually paves the way for mysticism, right? And so in some way, right, the main idea of mysticism is that the universe is teeming with mystery, and through a whole variety of methods, through interacting with nature, through contemplating nature, through meditation, through acts of service, through ritual, you can connect with the mystery of the universe. And so to some extent, at the end of Maimonides, especially with this analogy, he's almost gone full circle, because Maimonides now, after one has done all the work, after one has gotten to the limits of where philosophic and scientific inquiration can take you, all that's left is to embrace the mystery of the universe. Because no matter what, right, for the Kabbalists, maybe mystery starts at step 1. For Maimonides, if mystery starts at step 10, you still have mystery. And so to some extent, Maimonides opens the door for an entirely different view of Judaism. And the reason why I'm saying this so strongly is because I believe it's a super important and often underrated part of Maimonides, where within the Tanakh and within the Talmud, there's very little mystery in Judaism. And what I mean by that is the Tanakh gives very straightforward truth claims that if we accept it, it does not cause mystery, right? If you read the Tanakh and you take it at face value, as maybe Judah Halevi does, you are left with a very straightforward picture of a monotheistic God who, in a lot of ways, you can understand, right? If, as Deuteronomy says, if you do good, God will give you rain. If you do bad, God will give you famine, right? Eventually, the rabbis and the Talmud rework that into saying, well, that really is a metaphor for heaven and hell. And so if you do good, you're going to go to heaven. If you do bad, you're going to go to hell, right? Whatever we think of as very standard traditional religion, right? That does not leave a lot of room for mystery there, because everything is somewhat dogmatically straightforward. All of a sudden, with Maimonides' new formulation of Judaism, this is why Maimonides was so radical in so many different ways and really changed the course of Judaism to the extent where any conversation about Jewish thought and the evolution of Jewish ideas has to run through Maimonides, regardless of whether one ends up a Kabbalist or a rationalist or a Jewish legalist, is that Maimonides completely reworks this paradigm and suggests that no, at the center of Judaism and at the center of all of this, there is mystery. And so it opens the door for a Jewish life and a way of Jewish being that isn't content with, well, I have X, Y, and Z dogmatic truths, and that's where I live my life by, but actually living a Jewish life is part of this wider search for truth, which again, if you want to go the mystical route, can lead you to the mystical route. If you want to say, well, my Jewish service, right? There's a really interesting essay by Albert Einstein that goes along these lines. My service to Jewish tradition is uncovering secrets of the universe through scientific inquiry. You can go that route. If you want to say, my service for perfecting myself is rigid adherence to Jewish law and the legal tradition, you can go that route. And if you want to say, I want to center my life around bettering the world and helping others, right? You can also go that route for Maimonides. And it's that last point that Maimonides actually ends his book by. And for a thinker that's so philosophic and mathematical and rational and rigid, Maimonides leaves us at the end of his book with, I believe, a fascinating worldview of a thinker who obviously had his own internal struggles, right? Maimonides, I don't believe he had all the answers either, of course. He thought that was impossible. But where Maimonides leaves us off is one of the most fascinating parts, I believe, of Jewish thought. So I want to end there, at least for this time. And it's a bit of a chunk of text here. So I apologize for everybody, but I think it's going to be worthwhile. So this is the last chapter of the Guide to the Perplexed. So Maimonides has just given us thousands of pages of understanding Judaism according to Greek philosophy, of Judaism being about philosophy. And Maimonides is going through the different levels of perfection that humans can reach. And so he is going to tell us about the highest type of perfection, right? So what is the highest degree of perfection that, according to Maimonides, you can attain in your life? So here is what he says. The fourth degree of perfection is the true perfection of man, the possession of the highest intellectual faculties, the possession of such notions which lead to true metaphysical opinions as regards to God. With this perfection, man has attained his final object. It gives him true human perfection. It remains to him alone. It gives him immorality, and on its account, he is called man. So hopefully this is not surprising, right? He's reiterating his main point, but he continues. The prophets have likewise explained unto us these things and have expressed the same opinions on them as the philosophers. They say distinctly that perfection in property and health or in character is not a perfection worthy to be sought as a course of pride and glory for us, that knowledge of God, i.e. true wisdom, is the only perfection which we should seek and in which we should glorify ourselves. So he's saying, don't worry about having a nice house. Don't worry about having a nice job, right? The only thing that humans should be striving for is this perfection of God, which is philosophic inquiry, right? Again, hopefully nothing new. Jeremiah, referring to these kinds of perfection, says, thus says the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might, let not the rich man glory in his riches, but let him that glory in this, that he understands and knows me. So here is what Maimonides does with this. And this is how he finishes off his magnum opus. The prophet does not content himself with explaining that the knowledge of God is the highest kind of perfection. He says, however, that man can only glory in the knowledge of God and the knowledge of his ways and attributes, which are his actions, as we have sown. In expanding the passage, show me now thy ways. We are thus told in this passage that divine acts which ought to be known and ought to serve as a guide for our actions are chesed, loving kindness, mishpat, judgment, and tzedakah, righteousness. Another very important lesson is taught by the additional phrase, in the earth. It implies a fundamental principle of the law. It rejects the theory of those who boldly asserts that God's providence does not extend below the spheres of the moon, and that the earth with its contents is abandoned, that the Lord has forsaken the earth. So Maimonides, all of a sudden, at the end of his book, now seems to be switching tunes. He's talking knowledge, philosophy, and he says, but wait, knowledge of God is in some way emulating how our tradition imagines God to be. And our tradition imagines God to be a provider of mishpat, tzedakah, and chesed. And he says this is actually how you bring God on earth, right? He says that there are some that believe that God has nothing to do with the earth, right? This is the position of Aristotle, that there's a God that's behind the scenes somewhere, and that there's no such thing as God on earth. What Maimonides is saying is that they're wrong, right? They're not wrong because Maimonides believed that God was, the type of person you can talk to and is going to openly change the confines of, and produce miracles every minute, but that we actually have an opportunity in life to emulate God in some sense. He says it teaches, as has been taught by the greatest of all wise men in the world, the earth is the Lord's, that his providence extends to the earth in accordance with his nature in the same manner as it controls the heavens in accordance with their nature. This is expressed in the words that I am the Lord, which exercises loving kindness, justice, and righteousness on the earth. So Maimonides continues, right? I'll skip the rest of this paragraph, but Maimonides continues to build the argument that real godliness and the real way to discover God on earth, once you're done with all of this philosophic exploration, right? It's almost the cliche that the real truth was there the whole time, right? You go on this journey of philosophic and rational inquiry and try to figure out the ins and outs of all of the truths in the world to try to really understand God through whatever principles necessary, through tradition, through philosophy, through math, through morals, through creativity, all the things we talked about. And at the end of the day, you're left with the way that you really find truth once you have all these other things is by emulating how our tradition sees God. And our tradition sees God through these acts of kindness towards one another. And so Maimonides goes on and he says, the object of the above passage is therefore to declare that the perfection in which man can truly glory is attained by him when he has acquired, as far as this is possible for man, the knowledge of God, the knowledge of his providence, and of the manner which it influences his creatures in the production and continued existence. Having acquired this knowledge, he will then be determined always to seek loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness, and thus to imitate the ways of God. We have explained this many times in this treaty. And now he concludes, right? This is just how he ends his book. So I'll read this here and then we can discuss for a couple minutes. This is all I thought proper to discuss in this treatise, and which I consider useful for men or people like you. I hope that by the help of God, you will, after due reflection, comprehend all the things which I have treated here. May he grant us and all of Israel with us to attain what he has promised us. Then the eyes of the blind shall be open and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light, that they dwell in the shadow of death. Upon them have the shadow signed. God is near to all those who call him. If they call him in truth and turn to him, he is found by everyone who seeks him. If he always goes towards him and never goes astray. Amen. And Maimonides ends his multi-hundred magnum opus with, again, full circle, right? Maimonides has taken us from a Judaism that in some ways rejects tradition because of tradition's basic lack of philosophic nuance, because tradition is the opposite of philosophy to some extent. If I accept something because somebody tells me this is true, that is the opposite of me accepting something because I have personally sought out answers and believe it's true. And so Maimonides takes us on a journey throughout basically all forms of knowledge in the earth to some extent. And he talks about how really the point of Judaism is philosophic perfection and bettering your own mind and making sure to connect to God through this. But at the end of the day, Maimonides says philosophic inquiry can only take you so far. Even the smartest and wisest of thinkers are never actually going to be able to see God. There's always going to be an unbridgeable gap between us and the truth. And so then what? And so rather than Maimonides ending off, right, this is why potentially, right, I'm sort of saying this off the cuff, but now that I'm thinking about it, it's true. Maimonides was dangerously close to almost leaving the Jewish canon in terms of his philosophy. I mean, there's a reason why Maimonides is studied by traditional Jewish thinkers. Somebody like Spinoza who, by the way, had very similar views to Maimonides, right? There's a reason why somebody like Spinoza oftentimes is not thought about as being a part of the Jewish canon, right? There's other obvious historic reasons for that also, but Maimonides ends up taking us full circle and says, because there's going to be that unbridgeable gap, we're going to be left with a couple of things, right? One, that constant mystery in the universe and that constant wanting to get at truth, even though it's an unbridgeable gap, right? That's when you get the mysticism of Jewish tradition. And at the end of the day, all we have to fall back on is how our tradition, and again, note the irony here, because he's quoting tradition at the very end of this, how our tradition imagines God to be. And that the real part of connecting to God, once you're past all of the philosophy and the inquiry, is to understand that what it means to really know God is to emulate God. And what it means to really emulate God is to take these ideas that our tradition has about God, that God is a creator, God is a provider, God is somebody who is involved in righteousness, in chesed, in tzedakah, and that needs to now be the modus operandi of somebody who truly wants to get close to God. And so we're left with again, Maimonides having taken us on this wild journey throughout Jewish thought, but he ends off in tradition, right? He starts off departing tradition and takes us almost full circle. Now, whether we think at the end of the day, and this will be the last thing I say, and then I would love some questions, whether or not the journey was necessary, whether or not the journey was worth it to some extent, right? That's going to be up to debate by later Jewish thinkers, right? There were clearly a lot in Jewish tradition who didn't think this journey was necessary, because this journey, by definition, is dangerous in some sense, because you go on this journey, and once you open the door for philosophic inquiry, there's a real danger that you might not come back, right? Once you open the door of, well, perhaps Jewish tradition is not true in some sense, where Maimonides starts off, right? Perhaps somebody takes that and runs with it, and they never come back to the part of Jewish tradition that is true, which for Maimonides is how he ends, where he says, at the end of the day, this is the closest to truth that we can come up with, right? A life that's constantly full of trying to reach God, of trying to continuously press into the inner chambers. And while we're doing that, understanding that no amount of internal philosophic or mystical speculation is ever going to get us there, for us to then also turn our time on doing the things that we know make a difference, which is bettering the world, bettering society, and all of these things. So I would love to hear some thoughts. If we have another few minutes, there's a couple other sources that I can suggest here, but I would love to hear where we're at now. Sylvia, go for it.
Just a kind of a query, I guess, about Maimonides. I read a bit about Maimonides and his rational outlook on who God is. You know, that you can't define him, you can't call him he or she, or doesn't have any, it's a big entity. Okay. But then coming back to tradition is that I'm thinking, and it's just a wild thought of my part, that perhaps some of his life experiences, like his brother's death, may have changed him in his way of thinking about who God is and about what we need to learn from life and how to get through life. And many people get through life by adhering to traditions, you know, and we do. So that's my thought.
Yeah, it's a great point. And also, I think it's an interesting point that comes up a lot whenever we're dealing with any historical thinkers, because there's almost, and this is a huge problem for historians and people who study thoughts of great people who are no longer here, which is we take for granted that everybody we know now goes through evolutions of thought. And if I wrote something 10 years ago, it might not be the same way that I think about any issue now, but usually whenever we're studying historical figures, we think of them as, well, what did Maimonides think? Where Maimonides, lived a very long life. He wrote a lot of things. He wrote a lot of things that contradict. So it's very difficult to figure out what Maimonides thought. So I really like the question of, perhaps he went through an evolution of thought. That's definitely one way to understand this, that this is an internal Maimonides changing of his view at some point, and maybe realizing at the end of the day, I don't want to call it futility, but the end limits of where philosophic inquiry can take you, especially if you really, to actually live in the world, right? The religion of Maimonides, to some extent, if somebody were to actually practice it, it's not really conducive to community. It's not conducive to personal growth to some extent, because again, Maimonides, at least how he comes across towards the beginning of his book, he would want the penultimate Jew to be somebody who's sitting there in a room just contemplating the wisdom of God, right, for their entire life. And Maimonides slowly moves us back towards tradition. So that's definitely one way to view it. For those who just didn't know about this interesting biographical incident of Maimonides, just what Sylvia was talking about is Maimonides' brother was a merchant, and he drowned on a ship. And so Maimonides also, he did write a good amount about this. And so it is always interesting to try to connect the dots of, did that change the way that he thinks about, divine providence and everything like that. So thank you so much, Sylvia. Other thoughts, questions, comments? Perfect. So I'll just end with a couple comments, and if anybody does have questions or comments, feel free to shout it out. So by now, right, there's two completely different ways to view my mind, right? This course was plugged as the great debates of medieval Jewish history, so I have to bring back some version of debate here. Now, of course, right, we started off with this quote by Abraham Abulafia, who was a student of Maimonides and also a Kabbalist. And so he and the philosophy of some of the early Kabbalists were that this is based off of a wider understanding of the Guide to the Perplexed and Maimonidean thought. And this will set us up nicely for our next class, which is going to be January 8th, I believe, which is Maimonides, by bringing Aristotle and by bringing the Greek philosophic tradition into Judaism, really brings this idea of infinity into Judaism. And once you bring the idea, right, the idea that God is infinite is not really an idea that shows up in the Tanakh or the Talmud, right? You're not going to get a lot of discussions about infinite, because of historians of mathematics will tell you even the idea of zero and the idea of infinity only really came into human thought in the Greek period at some point, right? So probably everybody here has heard of all these famous paradoxes, right? Zeno's paradox and all these other ways to play around with infinity. These were all post-Torah. And so from some perspective, the Torah does not contend with this idea of God being infinite. All of a sudden, with Maimonides' God being infinite, one way to understand the God being infinite and one way to read Maimonides is that for Maimonides, approaching God in any serious way was impossible, right? God is hopelessly transcendent. And we humans, right, we're just sort of playing around here, and we can try to, learn a little bit more about the scientific nature of the universe. But at the end of the day, God is hopelessly God is hopelessly transcendent up there, right? Another way to read Maimonides is that if God is infinite, that means that God is also ubiquitous, right? Also the idea that God is everywhere. And if God is not just infinite, but God is everywhere, that opens the door to mysticism. And so you could read Maimonides still as the staunch philosopher, staunch scientist that would reject any type of mysticism into Judaism, or you could end up building off of Maimonides as saying Maimonides opens the door for mysticism. And these are two directions that scholars of Maimonides are still debating now. Is Maimonides a precursor to Jewish mysticism, or the growth of Jewish mysticism we see happening in Spain, namely the Zohar with the spreading of Kabbalah? Or was Kabbalah a backlash to Maimonides' philosophy? And again, one of the biggest debates in the history of medieval Jewish thought, is Maimonides a precursor to Kabbalah, or is Kabbalah a backlash to Maimonides? And so we'll really discuss this with opening up the door for what is the Zohar and Kabbalistic thought, and how does Kabbalah end up taking a lot of these ideas we've been playing around with. And again, Kabbalah ends up repackaging all of these ideas into a radically new way to view tradition, which again, a lot of us are going to know about just through various Jewish tradition that was affected by Kabbalah. But until then, have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a wonderful rest of your Hanukkah. Reb Marsha wanted me to pitch next week. Lisa Armoni, who works for Hillel International, is going to be leading a ALI class. I forgot what the title is going to be about, but she is great. And so I would highly recommend for anybody who is free a week from today to come and hear Lisa Armoni talk about her work with Hillel International. Happy Hanukkah, and I will see you all very soon.
Chag Sameach. Thank you so much,
Thank you, Rabbi.
Normal. It's great. Thanks everybody for being here. Chag Sameach. Come back next week, and you will be back on January the 8th. Yes. Yay. Okay. Chag Sameach. Have a good night.